Sophie Bennett had been staring at Dante Romano's wine for exactly 4 minutes, 4 increasingly irresponsible minutes. She knew, because the antique clock above his private study had chimed once, and Sophie had somehow managed to spend the entire time dusting the same corner of his desk. Her eyes shifted toward the bottle again. Dark glass, cream label, deep burgundy seal, the kind of bottle that looked expensive enough to have its own security detail. Sophie tightened her fingers around the feather duster. She had work to do. There were shelves behind her, a fireplace mantel, 3 enormous windows, and enough polished furniture in Dante Romano's private study to keep a maid professionally occupied until retirement. Unfortunately, none of those things were currently sitting beside a crystal glass, looking as though they had been placed there specifically to destroy her common sense. Sophie looked toward the door, empty, then toward the hallway beyond it, also empty. Her gaze returned to the bottle. She narrowed her eyes. This was becoming personal. The bottle had been bothering her since she'd entered the room 15 minutes earlier, not because Sophie wanted a drink. At least, that was the version of events she intended to tell herself. It was the label. She recognized the vineyard, or she thought she did, and that small possibility had been scratching at the back of her mind ever since. Sophie moved toward the bookshelf, stopped, looked back. The wine remained exactly where Dante had left it. Of course it did. Wine didn't usually flee when accused of being suspicious. Sophie exhaled. Absolutely ridiculous. The bottle declined to defend itself. That somehow made things worse. She crossed the room, only to look. That was all. Looking was harmless. Looking had never gotten anyone dismissed from the employment of a man who could make grown men straighten their posture simply by entering a room. Probably. Sophie reached the desk. Up close, the label became clearer, and her expression changed. The playful curiosity disappeared for half a second. Her thumb brushed lightly over the faded emblem near the bottom, a vineyard crest, a particular year, a region she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a very long time. Something tightened beneath her ribs. Then, just as quickly, Sophie pushed the feeling away. No, she was not doing that today. She stepped back. Good. Excellent. Responsible adult behavior had finally arrived. Sophie turned toward the cleaning cart, took 2 steps, stopped, her eyes closed. Oh, for heaven's sake. She turned around again. That was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 was noticing the bottle had already been opened. There was no cork to struggle with, no seal to break, no obvious evidence that anyone had touched it. Just an expensive bottle of wine, already waiting. Sophie approached again. She leaned forward and smelled near the opening. Her eyebrows lifted. Interesting. She smelled again, more carefully this time. Dark cherry, oak, a little spice, something floral beneath it, and something else Sophie couldn't immediately place. That bothered her. She picked up the empty crystal glass, only to smell the wine properly. That was all. Sophie poured barely enough to cover the bottom. Then she stared at what she had done. Silence. The glass sat in her hand. The wine glimmered innocently beneath the afternoon light. Sophie looked toward the ceiling, as though divine intervention might arrive before poor judgment continued. It didn't. She lifted the glass, swirled it gently, breathed in. Her expression sharpened, and for one beautiful second. Sophie Bennett wasn't standing inside the private study of Chicago's most intimidating man. She wasn't wearing a pink maid's uniform. She wasn't thinking about laundry schedules, polished silver, rent, bills, or the fact that touching her employer's personal wine collection was probably somewhere between inadvisable and career suicide. She was somewhere else, somewhere years ago, somewhere with wooden barrels, dusty sunlight, her father's hands guiding hers around a glass while telling her to smell before she tasted. Sophie blinked. The memory disappeared. She looked down at the wine. That had been enough. She should pour it away. Except Pouring expensive wine away would be wasteful, and Sophie Bennett had many flaws, but she was not wasteful. Therefore, drinking it was practically an act of financial responsibility. Sophie nodded to herself. Excellent reasoning, completely defensible. She raised the glass. One sip. That was the plan. A tiny taste. Then she would return the glass, finish cleaning, and spend the remainder of her employment pretending none of this had occurred. The wine touched her tongue. Sophie froze. Her eyes narrowed. She swallowed slowly, then stared at the glass. No. She tasted again. A slightly larger sip. Her face changed. Now she looked offended. You cost how much? Unfortunately for Sophie, the bottle still wasn't interested in answering questions. She examined the label again, then tasted once more. By the third sip, curiosity had transformed into professional outrage. This is showing off! She swirled the glass. Completely unnecessary oak. Another sip. And whoever told him this needed another 12 years in a cellar should be arrested. Sophie paused, considered whose wine she was criticizing. Her lips twitched. Actually, perhaps not arrested. He might take that suggestion seriously. She lifted the glass again, then stopped halfway. Sophie stared at it. This was becoming ridiculous. She had already tasted enough to satisfy curiosity. More than enough, actually. Any further investigation would stop being professional curiosity and become drinking Dante Romano's wine, which was exactly what she was doing. Sophie lowered the glass. Done. She placed it beside the bottle. There. Finished. Common sense had finally won. Late, but still technically victorious. Sophie picked up her feather duster and returned to the bookshelf. 3 seconds passed. Her eyes moved toward the desk. No. She dusted another shelf. Looked again. Absolutely not. She turned her back to the bottle. That should solve everything. Unfortunately, Sophie possessed peripheral vision. She could still see the glass. Barely, but enough. She frowned. The problem was that the wine had changed after sitting in the glass. The aroma would be opening now. And if she had already committed the crime, surely leaving before obtaining complete information would simply make the crime pointless. Sophie slowly looked over her shoulder. The glass waited. She sighed. This is how people end up in documentaries. She returned to the desk. Not quickly. A woman walking toward possible unemployment should at least maintain dignity. Sophie picked up the glass again. This time she swirled it longer, waited, smelled. Her eyebrows rose. There it was. The heavier oak had softened slightly. The fruit came through better now. Sophie tasted. Her expression changed. Another tiny sip. Oh! She looked at the bottle. So, now you decide to behave. Sophie turned the label toward herself. The bottle was beginning to annoy her for entirely different reasons. Because it was good. Very good. Still too expensive, but good. She tasted again, then frowned. No, don't become smug. Silence. $4,000 does not make you special. Another sip. It makes somebody irresponsible. Sophie paused. Her gaze slowly traveled across Dante's study. Hand-carved desk, leather chairs, imported rug, artwork that probably required insurance policies of their own. Her eyes returned to the bottle. Actually, irresponsibility may not be his primary financial concern. The corner of her mouth lifted. She had become far too comfortable. That should have worried her. Instead, she pulled out the chair beside the desk, then stopped. Absolutely not. Standing while stealing wine was one thing. Sitting down would suggest permanence. Sophie pushed the chair back. Good. Boundaries. She leaned against the edge of the desk instead, which apparently was completely different. The glass rested delicately between her fingers. For several moments, she simply enjoyed the taste. And that was when something inconvenient happened. She remembered. Not clearly. Memories rarely asked permission before arriving. A wooden counter, rows of mismatched glasses, Her father's old notebook lying open beside a corkscrew, the smell of crushed grapes and polished wood. His laugh when Sophie had once declared that an expensive bottle tasted like angry berries. She had been 16. He had laughed for almost a full minute. Then he'd told her that descriptions didn't need to sound impressive. They needed to be true. Sophie lowered the glass. Her smile faded. That memory had been buried carefully. Very carefully. She hadn't asked for it back. Not today. Not inside Dante Romano's study. Not while wearing a pink maid's uniform and illegally borrowing his cabernet. Sophie blinked once. Then again. She placed the glass down. For real this time. Enough. She reached for the cleaning cloth and immediately knocked the cork slightly sideways. It rolled across the desk. Sophie caught it just before it reached the edge. She stared at it, then looked toward the door. Still empty. Her shoulders relaxed. See? She whispered toward herself. Perfectly under control. The cork slipped from her fingers, dropped, bounced once, and disappeared beneath Dante's desk. Sophie closed her eyes. Of course it did. She crouched. The desk was enormous. Because naturally Dante Romano couldn't own furniture designed for ordinary human proportions. Sophie reached beneath it. Nothing. She leaned farther. Her hair slipped across her cheek. Still nothing. Her fingertips finally touched the cork. Got you. She stood too quickly. Her hip bumped the desk. The wine in her glass trembled dangerously. Sophie grabbed it. Not one drop spilled. She froze, then slowly smiled. Professional. She set the cork beside the bottle, then noticed she'd left a faint fingerprint on the polished desk. Her eyes widened. No. Evidence. Sophie grabbed her cloth and polished the spot. Then another. Then the area around the bottle. Then the stem of the glass. She stopped. Looked at what she was doing. Oh, brilliant. Now she wasn't simply drinking the Mafia boss's wine. She was wiping fingerprints afterward. This had become criminally organized. Sophie placed the cloth down. She needed to leave. Immediately. Before curiosity promoted itself into a felony. She gathered her supplies. Took one step toward the door, then glanced at the glass. There was still wine left. Not much, but enough to be suspicious. Pouring it back into the bottle would be disgusting. Pouring it away would be wasteful. Leaving it there would be evidence. Sophie stared. Every option was terrible. She picked up the glass. One final sip. For disposal purposes, obviously. She drank, then realized it wasn't empty. Sophie frowned into the glass. How are you still here? Another sip. Better. One tiny mouthful remained. At this point, Sophie felt personally challenged. She raised the glass again. And that was when Dante Romano returned to his own house. He had arrived 7 minutes earlier. His afternoon meeting had ended unexpectedly ahead of schedule. The black car had entered through the eastern drive. 2 guards followed him through the marble entrance. Dante handed his jacket to one of them, loosened the watch around his wrist, and headed toward his private study. Nothing unusual, nothing remotely interesting, until his footsteps slowed. A woman's voice was coming from inside. Dante stopped. The guard behind him stopped too. From beyond the partly open door came Sophie Bennett's voice. Financial irresponsibility. Silence. One of Dante's eyebrows moved. The guard beside him stared straight ahead. Dante took another step. The door gave him a narrow view into the room. Sophie Bennett was leaning against his desk, holding his crystal glass, drinking his wine. Dante said nothing, for several seconds. He simply watched. The surprising part wasn't that she'd touched the bottle. People occasionally made stupid decisions. The surprising part was how, completely at home, Sophie appeared, while making hers. Her feather duster had been abandoned beside his papers. A cleaning cloth sat beside the decanter. And his curvy maid was studying his wine with the concentration of someone evaluating a hostile business proposal. Sophie took another sip. Her nose wrinkled. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger. with curiosity, still showing off. Behind him, the guard's mouth twitched. Dante turned his head. The man's expression immediately became professional enough for a military portrait. Dante looked back inside. Sophie swirled the wine. Too dramatic. Dante folded his arms. The guard discovered an intense interest in the opposite wall. Sophie continued. You could have been charming. A pause. But no. Another sip. You needed everyone to know you were expensive. Dante's gaze moved slowly toward the bottle, then back to Sophie. Now he understood. She was criticizing his wine. Probably. Sophie frowned thoughtfully. Actually, that sounds familiar. Dante's eyes sharpened. The guard beside him became suddenly fascinated by the ceiling. Sophie smiled to herself. She had absolutely no idea she had an audience, and that made the entire situation considerably more entertaining. There was no performance, no attempt to impress him, no careful behavior because her employer was nearby. This was simply Sophie Bennett, alone, with expensive wine, and apparently more opinions than survival instinct. Dante should have entered. He didn't. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, watching. Sophie examined the glass again. You and I are finished. Dante's mouth almost curved. Sophie nodded firmly. Completely. Then she lifted the glass again. Dante's eyebrow rose. Sophie stared at the remaining wine. This is cleanup. The guard looked down. Dante suspected the man was attempting not to laugh. Sophie drank, then set down the glass. Done. She picked up her feather duster. Stopped. Looked at the bottle. Dante waited, and suddenly, the humor left Sophie's face. Her thumb moved across the vineyard crest. Gently. Something inside her expression changed. Not embarrassment, not guilt. Something quieter. Something Dante hadn't expected. Sophie stared at the label. Then whispered, Dad would have hated this vintage. Dante's amusement disappeared. The sentence was barely audible, but he heard it. Sophie seemed to realize she'd spoken aloud. She straightened quickly. The vulnerability vanished almost instantly. She reached toward her cleaning cart, then stopped. Her head tilted. Dante had shifted his weight. Barely, but she'd heard him. Sophie looked toward the hallway. Nothing. From her angle, the doorway appeared empty. She frowned. Hello. Silence. Dante stepped beyond her line of sight. Sophie's eyes narrowed. Perhaps a gardener. Perhaps Mrs. Russo. Perhaps one of Dante's guards doing whatever intimidating men did when they weren't standing around looking intimidating. She waited. Nothing happened. Sophie shook her head. Wonderful. She turned around. Now I'm hallucinating. Dante stepped silently into the study. Sophie remained unaware. She began arranging her supplies. He moved closer. Still nothing. She straightened a stack of papers she had absolutely no permission to straighten. Dante crossed half the room. Then Sophie froze. A footstep. Definitely. Behind her. Her fingers tightened around the feather duster. Slowly, she turned halfway. Nothing. Dante had moved toward the opposite side of the tall bookcase. Sophie stared suspiciously at the doorway, then at the room. Silence. If this house is haunted, she waited. I am quitting. Behind the bookcase, Dante looked toward the ceiling. Apparently the ghosts would need to file their complaints separately. Sophie turned forward again. She reached for the empty glass, looked inside. One final drop clung stubbornly near the bottom. She tilted it. Dante stepped out from behind the bookcase. Sophie didn't notice. She raised the glass, trying to catch the last drop. Dante approached. 10 feet. 8. 6. Sophie tipped her head slightly farther back. Come on. Dante stopped directly behind her. Sophie gently shook the glass. Don't become difficult now. The drop finally moved. Sophie smiled. Victory. She raised the rim toward her lips. Then, a man's hand appeared beside hers. Sophie stopped, completely. Her eyes moved toward the hand. Large, tanned, expensive watch. Black cuff rolled just enough to reveal a strong forearm. Her expression collapsed. Oh, no. The hand didn't take the glass. It settled calmly on the desk. Then another arm appeared on her opposite side. Sophie stared straight ahead. She didn't need to turn around. She knew that watch. She had seen it every morning at breakfast, usually attached to a man whose employees suddenly remembered excellent posture whenever he entered the room. Her shoulders rose slowly. Warmth settled behind her. Close, far too close. Dante Romano. Sophie closed her eyes. Perhaps time could reverse itself. 3 minutes would be enough. 2. She wasn't greedy. Unfortunately, time refused negotiations. Dante leaned slightly closer. His gaze traveled toward the crystal glass, still suspended beside Sophie's mouth, then toward his bottle. Then back to her. His voice came low beside her ear. Calm. Far, far too calm. Enjoying yourself? Sophie froze. The glass remained mid-sip. Her eyes widened. No movement. No blinking. For 3 long seconds, Sophie Bennett ceased being an employee and became expensive furniture. Dante waited. She swallowed. Unfortunately, so did the last drop of wine. Dante's eyebrow lifted. Sophie realized what she had just done. She had swallowed the evidence, while being caught with the evidence. Excellent. Very innocent. Very convincing. Slowly, very slowly, she turned her head. Dante Romano was staring down at her. Black shirt, open collar, dark hair swept away from his face, expression controlled, his chest close behind her shoulder, and somewhere beneath those intimidating dark eyes, Sophie saw it. Amusement. The horrible man was enjoying this. Her gaze moved toward the doorway. One guard remained several yards away. The man had apparently decided the chandelier deserved his complete professional attention. Traitor. Sophie looked back at Dante. Mr. Romano. One eyebrow lifted. Miss Bennett. That was worse. Much worse. Sophie immediately moved away from the desk. Dante shifted enough to allow it. She stepped sideways. The glass remained in her hand. She noticed, panicked, and placed it behind her back. Dante's eyes moved toward her hidden arm, then slowly returned to her face. Sophie stared at him. He stared at her. She brought the glass forward again. There were moments when commitment became stupidity. Her mind began searching desperately for an explanation. Any explanation. She considered honesty unpleasant. She considered fainting too theatrical. She considered pretending someone else had been drinking. There were 3 people nearby, and one of them owned the house. Then Sophie's brain produced something. Unfortunately, it arrived unsupervised. I was cleaning it. Dante looked at the glass, then at Sophie. She immediately regretted every decision she'd made since breakfast. His gaze moved back toward the crystal. Cleaning it? Sophie nodded. Weakly. Yes. Dante glanced toward the bottle, then the empty glass. With wine. Silence. Outside the study, the guard coughed. Sophie shot him a look. The coward immediately looked away. Dante waited. Sophie straightened. If she was about to lose her job, she would at least lose it with dignity. Or whatever remained of it. It was a complicated cleaning process. Dante stared at her. Apparently. Sophie pressed her lips together. Stop talking. That was the intelligent choice. Her mouth disagreed. It required quality control. Something moved at the corner of Dante's mouth. Barely. But Sophie saw it. And somehow, that frightened her more than anger. Angry Dante Romano. Simple. Apologize. Leave. Update resume. Possibly relocate. But amused Dante Romano. There was no procedure for that. He reached around her. Sophie stiffened. His hand closed around the bottle. He lifted it. Looked at the remaining wine, then at Sophie. Very thorough quality control. Her eyes followed the bottle. It did appear slightly emptier than she'd realized. That glass is wider than it looks. Dante glanced toward the glass. Sophie wanted the sentence back immediately. The guard coughed again. Dante turned. One look. The coughing stopped. Sophie decided she liked that guard less every second. Dante placed the bottle back on the desk. Did it pass? Sophie blinked. What? The inspection. Her lips parted. This was not going how she'd rehearsed being caught stealing from a Mafia boss. Dante leaned against the edge of the desk. You've apparently invested considerable time determining whether my wine is acceptable. Sophie looked at him carefully. He seemed serious. Mostly. That tiny thread of amusement remained. She selected the safest answer possible. It passed. Dante waited. Sophie held his gaze. 1 second. 2. She sighed. No. His eyebrow lifted. She folded her arms. Oh, come on. You heard me, didn't you? A pause. Dante's silence answered everything. Sophie's cheeks warmed. Every comment returned at once. Showing off. Financial irresponsibility. Too dramatic. Sounds familiar. Her eyes widened. How long were you standing there? Dante considered the question. Long enough. Sophie stared at him. That was horrible. A number would have been kinder. She looked toward the guard. He provided absolutely no assistance. She returned to Dante. I would like to formally withdraw several comments. Which ones? All. Interesting. I was speaking privately. In my study. Sophie opened her mouth. Stopped. Yes. That weakened the privacy argument considerably. Dante reached for another crystal glass. Sophie watched suspiciously. He poured a small amount of wine. Then, to Sophie's disbelief, held it toward her. She looked at the glass. Then at him. No. One eyebrow rose. No. This feels like a trap. You preferred stealing it. Sophie stared. That is an extremely aggressive interpretation. Dante looked toward the glass she had been holding. You were drinking my wine. A beat. In my study. Another beat. While insulting it. Sophie considered. All right. Moderately aggressive. Dante offered the glass again. She still didn't take it. What are you doing? Quality control. Sophie stared at him. Outside the doorway. The guard suddenly found the chandelier fascinating again. Sophie narrowed her eyes. You're mocking me. Am I? Yes? Then don't drink it. Sophie's eyes dropped toward the wine. That was unfair. Dante knew exactly what he was doing. She took the glass. His mouth almost curved. Sophie caught it immediately. Oh, you are enjoying yourself. Dante said nothing. She looked down at the wine. Then something changed. The embarrassment softened. The jokes quieted. Instinct took over. Sophie swirled the glass. Waited. Smelled. Dante noticed. The movement was effortless. Not copied. Not hesitant. Practiced. Sophie tasted. Her eyes narrowed. She tasted once more. The nervous maid who had been inventing terrible excuses disappeared. Something calmer replaced her. Focused. Certain. Dante watched carefully. Well? Sophie glanced toward the bottle. You opened this recently. How recently? She thought. 40 minutes. Dante's expression changed. Barely. Sophie didn't notice. Maybe 45. Dante's gaze flicked toward the clock. 43. His eyes returned to her. Sophie tasted again. The year isn't terrible. That sounds generous. It is. His mouth almost moved. What? The vineyard had too much rain near harvest. The amusement vanished from Dante's eyes. Sophie continued, completely unaware she was revealing something much larger than her theft. They compensated with longer oak aging. Her gaze returned to the wine. Too much, actually. Dante folded his arms. That explains why it feels heavier than it should. A pause. And the vintage? 2014. I can read. Sophie gave him a look. Congratulations. Silence. The guard outside abruptly turned away. Dante's eyebrow rose. Sophie remembered who she had just congratulated on literacy. Sorry. A beat. Mostly. For the briefest second, Dante nearly smiled. Sophie looked back at the bottle. 2012 was better. How much better? Enough that whoever convinced you to buy this probably knew you wouldn't ask questions. Silence. Sophie finally looked up. Dante wasn't looking at the bottle anymore. He was looking at her. Differently. The amusement remained, but beneath it was something sharper. Interest. Real interest. Sophie's stomach tightened. She slowly lowered the glass. Dante's gaze traveled toward her hand, then her face. Where did you learn that? There it was. Sophie looked toward the bottle. Learn what? Dante's expression made it very clear that insulting his intelligence repeatedly might eventually become hazardous. The harvest. Sophie swallowed. I read about rainfall conditions from 11 years ago, she thought. Yes. Dante waited. Sophie offered a weak smile. I read. Aggressively. Silence. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. She looked down at her glass. Even the wine seemed embarrassed for her. Dante continued watching. Sophie shifted her weight. The old memories tried returning. Wooden counters. Her father's notebook. The vineyard. That crooked little sign. The life she'd buried. She pushed everything away. Dante noticed. And unexpectedly, he didn't ask again. No interrogation. No command. No demand that Sophie explain herself. He simply reached forward and took the glass from her hand. Sophie looked up. Dante placed it beside his own, then turned toward the doorway. She blinked. That was it? She still had employment? Apparently. Dante walked toward the hall. Sophie remained beside the desk, confused. He reached the doorway, stopped. Tomorrow. Sophie frowned. Tomorrow what? Dante looked back. 7. She stared. 7 what? 7 o'clock, Sophie. I know how clocks work. There it was again. That almost smile. Sophie's eyes narrowed. Am I being fired at 7? No, because mornings would be preferable. I'd like daylight while carrying my boxes. Dante's gaze shifted toward the wine bottle. Tomorrow you're going to explain why the 2012 is better. Sophie blinked. Looked at the bottle. Then back at him. You're asking me to drink wine with you? No. A beat. His expression remained completely serious. I'm supervising you. Sophie stared. You caught me drinking 1 glass. Several inspections. 1 glass. Repeatedly. That is still 1 glass. Dante stepped into the corridor. Sophie watched him leave. Then he stopped again. And Sophie? She straightened. Yes? Dante glanced over his shoulder. Next time you insult a $4,000 bottle. Sophie's cheeks warmed. His eyes moved toward the empty glass. Try not to drink most of the evidence. Sophie gasped. That was not most of it. Dante continued walking. His guard followed. Sophie stared after them, then toward the bottle, then the glass, then back at the doorway. That was barely. She checked the bottle, stopped, frowned. All right. A pause. Perhaps the inspection became enthusiastic. From somewhere farther down the corridor, a man's laugh reached her. Low, brief, gone almost immediately. Sophie froze. Dante Romano had laughed. Because of her. That should not have made her smile. It did. Slowly, Sophie looked toward the bottle again. Her fingertips brushed the faded vineyard crest. And the smile softened. Because Dante hadn't merely caught her stealing wine, he had noticed something Sophie had spent years trying to bury. The woman who knew vineyards, the daughter who knew vintages, the girl who had once believed wine would become her entire future. Tomorrow. Sophie Bennett would sit across from Dante Romano and somehow try to convince one of Chicago's most observant men that none of that meant anything. Unfortunately for Sophie, Dante Romano had built his entire life around noticing what other people tried to hide, and he was already curious, very curious. But neither of them understood yet that this ridiculous afternoon would eventually become much more than an embarrassing story about a curious maid stealing her employer's wine, because weeks later, another bottle would be placed in front of Dante Romano. Same expensive label, same dark glass, same flawless seal. Everyone else in the room would see wine, Sophie would see something wrong, and when Dante lifted his glass, she would realize that the knowledge she'd spent years trying to forget was suddenly the only thing standing between him and a sip he was never supposed to survive. By 7:30 the following morning, Sophie Bennett had developed a very reasonable plan. Avoid Dante Romano. Completely. Forever, if possible. It was an ambitious strategy considering she worked inside his house, but Sophie believed in herself. She entered the breakfast room, carrying fresh napkins, and immediately discovered Dante sitting at the head of the table. Plan failed, spectacularly. Sophie stopped for half a second. Dante looked up from the document in his hand. Their eyes met. Nothing happened. No smile, no comment, no mention of stolen wine. That was somehow worse. Sophie continued toward the table, with the careful dignity of a woman pretending she hadn't spent yesterday afternoon accusing her employer's cabernet of having personality defects. Dante returned to his paperwork. Sophie replaced one napkin, then another. She reached his side of the table. His wine glass from dinner sat nearby, empty. Sophie refused to look at it. Dante noticed. Of course he did. Careful. Her hand stopped. She looked at him. Dante's expression remained perfectly serious. That glass may require inspection. Sophie stared. Across the room, one of his guards suddenly developed a cough. Mrs. Russo, the senior housekeeper, continued arranging flowers as though she had heard absolutely nothing. Sophie narrowed her eyes. You said 7. Dante glanced toward the clock. It isn't 7. Exactly. A faint movement appeared near his mouth. Sophie immediately regretted giving him ammunition. She finished with the napkins and escaped, or attempted to. By 10 o'clock, Dante had passed her in the main corridor twice. The first time, he said nothing. The second time, his gaze dropped briefly toward the tray in her hands. Water. Nothing alcoholic. Still. His eyebrow lifted. Sophie kept walking. At 11:30, she entered the library to collect a stack of used coffee cups. Dante was inside with Leo Marchetti, his right-hand man. Leo had worked beside Dante long enough to survive difficult meetings, hostile negotiations, and several occasions when Dante had been in a very unpleasant mood. What Leo had apparently never witnessed was his boss quietly tormenting a maid over a wine glass. Sophie collected the cups. Dante continued speaking to Leo about something involving warehouses and contracts. Professional, cold, controlled. Sophie almost relaxed. Then, without looking at her, Dante said, "The cellar is downstairs." She stopped. Leo looked confused. Sophie looked offended. Dante turned one page of the document. "In case you've become lost." Leo's eyes moved slowly from Dante to Sophie, then back again. Sophie straightened. "I know where the cellar is. I assumed." She stared at him. Dante still hadn't looked up. Sophie walked out before she could say something that would result in actual unemployment. Behind her, Leo waited 3 seconds, then asked the obvious question. Dante did not answer, which made Leo considerably more interested. By lunch, Sophie realized something terrible. Dante Romano was enjoying himself. Worse, she was beginning to enjoy fighting back. That was dangerous. Men like Dante were not supposed to become entertaining. They were supposed to remain distant, intimidating, possibly framed by dramatic lighting, while everyone else made sensible decisions. Instead, Sophie had discovered that beneath Dante Romano's terrifying reputation lived a man with a very dry sense of humor and enough patience to wait 6 hours between jokes. That afternoon, Mrs. Russo appeared in the laundry room. Sophie was folding towels. The older woman stopped beside the table. "Mr. Romano wants you in the dining room." Sophie froze with a towel halfway folded. "Why?" Mrs. Russo's expression remained neutral. "I wasn't informed." That meant she knew. Sophie could feel it. Mrs. Russo knew everything. The woman probably knew what Dante had eaten for breakfast before he did. Sophie placed the towel down. Does he look angry? Mrs. Russo considered. No, that was not comforting. Amused. Mrs. Russo's mouth almost twitched. Sophie sighed. Wonderful. She walked toward the dining room feeling as though she were approaching a disciplinary hearing. Instead, she found 3 bottles of wine sitting on the table, 3 glasses, and Dante Romano leaning against the window. Sophie stopped. Her suspicion arrived immediately. No. Dante looked at her. I haven't asked anything. You arranged props. His eyebrow lifted. Sophie pointed toward the bottles. Nothing good begins with 3 bottles and your expression. Dante approached the table. I need an opinion. Hire someone. I did. Sophie stared. You hired a sommelier? Dante looked directly at her. Apparently not. Sophie closed her eyes. This is workplace harassment. Yesterday it was quality control. She opened them again. You're going to use that forever, aren't you? Probably. That answer was so immediate, Sophie nearly laughed. She refused. Dante gestured toward the first bottle. Sophie looked at it. Then him. No. Why? Because yesterday was temporary insanity. You seemed remarkably sane by the 3rd glass. 1 glass. Repeated inspections. Sophie folded her arms. Dante waited. That was another problem. He could wait forever. Eventually, Sophie moved toward the table. Fine. Dante's gaze sharpened slightly. She picked up the first glass. And the moment she smelled the wine, something in her changed. Again, Dante saw it. The humor remained, but the performance disappeared. Sophie tasted carefully, paused, then moved to the second. She didn't rush. She didn't exaggerate. She simply knew what she was looking for. The second wine earned a small frown. The third earned something closer to approval. Dante watched quietly. Finally, Sophie pointed toward the least expensive bottle. That one. Dante looked at it. Why? Because it's better. The other 2 cost 6 times as much. Sophie shrugged. That sounds like their problem. Dante's mouth almost curved. She continued, before he could interrupt. The first one is trying too hard. The second is technically good, but it has no personality. And the third, Sophie tasted it again. It knows what it is. Dante leaned against the table. That is your professional terminology. I told you I'm not a professional. No. His gaze settled on her. You told me you read aggressively. Sophie became very interested in the glass. Dante noticed. He did not press. Instead, he selected the 3rd bottle. Dinner tonight, Sophie blinked. With 6 people. Business. Yes. She looked at the bottle. Then this works better. Dante nodded once. No argument. No second opinion. Just trust. That surprised her. Sophie slowly lowered the glass. You're actually going to serve the one I chose. You sound disappointed. I expected you to ignore me. Why ask? That answer landed differently. Simple. Dante Romano did not ask for opinions he intended to dismiss. Sophie studied him for a second, then looked away before he noticed she was studying him. Unfortunately, he noticed. Of course he did. She picked up the first bottle again. Who buys these for you? A supplier. He doesn't like you. Dante's eyebrow lifted. Sophie pointed at the label. Or he assumes you're impressed by numbers. Price, age, reputation, rarity. She looked toward the 3 bottles. People buy expensive wine for the same reason they buy enormous watches. Dante glanced at his wrist. Sophie saw it. Her eyes widened. No. Too late. Dante looked at his watch, then at her. Sophie immediately corrected herself. Your watch is very tasteful. Interesting. Elegant. Yesterday my wine was dramatic. That was the wine. And today, Sophie stared at the watch, then at him. She decided survival required strategic retreat. I should return to work. She moved toward the door. Dante let her take 3 steps. Then, Sophie. She turned. He was holding the second bottle, the one she disliked. Take it. Her eyes widened. What? For the kitchen. You're giving away a bottle that costs. You don't like it. That is not a financial system. It is now. Sophie stared at him, then started laughing. She couldn't help it. Dante's expression remained controlled, but there it was again. That tiny, almost smile. And for some reason, that affected Sophie more than a full grin would have. She picked up the bottle. At the doorway, Dante spoke again. 7. Sophie turned. He looked toward the remaining 2 bottles. Don't be late. She should have refused. Instead, Sophie smiled. Depends. On? Whether you're serving anything worth stealing. For one beautiful second, Dante Romano looked genuinely caught off guard. Sophie walked out before he recovered. Behind her, Leo Marchetti entered through the opposite door. He looked toward Dante, then toward Sophie disappearing down the corridor with an expensive bottle in her hands. Leo considered asking. Dante looked at him. Leo decided life was valuable. That evening, the 3rd bottle was served. Dante's guests loved it. Sophie knew because one of the waiters returned to the kitchen twice, asking for another bottle. She pretended not to care. At exactly 7, a guard appeared in the kitchen carrying an empty wineglass. Sophie stared at him. The guard stared back, then held out the glass. Boss said you'd understand. Sophie looked at the glass, then toward the ceiling. This man was impossible. She took it and went downstairs. What Sophie didn't know was that Dante had spent the entire dinner wondering why his maid's opinion had mattered more to him than that of every wealthy man sitting at his table. And he disliked unanswered questions, especially when the answer wore pink, laughed at his wine, and looked at him as though being Dante Romano was merely a personality inconvenience. The private tastings became a habit. Not immediately. That would have been suspicious. At first, they happened every few days. Then twice in 1 week. Then Sophie noticed that Dante somehow required her opinion whenever any bottle entered the Romano estate. A client sent champagne. Sophie was summoned. A shipment arrived from France. Sophie was summoned. Leo brought Dante a bottle from a restaurant owner. Sophie was summoned. By the 3rd week, Sophie walked into Dante's study, looked at the bottle waiting on his desk, and folded her arms. This is getting ridiculous. Dante glanced up. What is? You. His eyebrow lifted. Sophie pointed. That bottle arrived 20 minutes ago. Dante said nothing. I know because I signed for it. Still nothing. You called me upstairs before the delivery man reached the gate. Dante considered. Efficient. Sophie stared, then looked toward Leo, who was standing beside the window. Does he do this to everyone? Leo looked at Dante, then at Sophie. I have survived 10 years by not answering questions like that. Sophie nodded. Wise. Dante ignored both of them. The wine was opened. Sophie tasted. Dante listened. Leo watched the 2 of them with increasing fascination. The strange thing was, Dante wasn't simply flirting. He genuinely valued Sophie's judgment. If she disliked something, he asked why. If she preferred a cheaper bottle, he didn't correct her. He wanted the reasoning. And Sophie, despite herself, loved that. For years, wine had been something she kept locked away with every other memory connected to her father. Now, Dante was quietly forcing that door open, not by interrogating her, not by pitying her, by asking, what do you think? It shouldn't have mattered. It did. Soon, the estate staff began noticing other things. Dante started leaving an empty glass beside his during evening tastings. He never told Sophie to use it. He simply placed it there. The first time, she ignored it. The second time, also ignored. The third time, she stared at it for nearly a minute. Dante continued reading. Sophie finally picked it up. Manipulative. Dante turned a page. You poured it yourself. She hated that he was right. Mrs. Russo noticed the glasses. She said nothing. which was considerably more threatening than if she'd said everything. The guards noticed too. One evening, Sophie entered the wine room and found two of them standing outside. They immediately stopped talking. Sophie narrowed her eyes. What? Both men looked innocent, suspiciously innocent. She pointed toward the younger one. You, he swallowed. What were you discussing? Security. Of course. Sophie looked toward the other. Security also involved my name. Silence. She smiled slowly. Interesting. The younger guard immediately looked toward the floor. Sophie entered the wine room. Dante was inside. She closed the door behind herself. Your employees are gossiping. Dante selected a bottle. So are mine. She blinked. Excuse me? You work here. Sophie opened her mouth. Stopped. That isn't the point. Dante handed her the bottle. Sophie took it automatically, then realized what he'd done. Don't distract me with Burgundy. It worked. She stared. Dante almost smiled. This was becoming a problem. A serious one. Not because Dante was flirting aggressively. He wasn't. That would have been easier. The attraction lived in tiny places. Dante, remembering Sophie, hated overly dry whites. Sophie bringing a sandwich because he had skipped dinner again. His hand appearing at her waist when she nearly backed into a shelf. The way he checked the chair before she sat, automatically. The way Sophie caught him watching when she laughed. The way he looked away, approximately half a second too late. Nothing dramatic. Nothing they could accuse each other of, which made it worse. One Thursday evening, Sophie entered the cellar, carrying 2 small plates of cheese from the kitchen. Dante looked at them. You brought food. You forget food exists. I had lunch. At 11. Dante glanced toward the clock. 8:30. Sophie placed a plate in front of him. Exactly. He looked at her, then the plate, then ate. Sophie smiled triumphantly. You're welcome. Dante shook his head, but ate everything. That tiny victory pleased Sophie more than it should have. An hour later, they were arguing over whether a particular wine was elegant or boring. Dante called it restrained. Sophie called restrained a polite word people used when they were afraid to say boring. Dante accused her of having no respect for tradition. Sophie accused him of purchasing tradition by the case. The argument continued until Sophie laughed so hard she had to put down her glass. And then Dante laughed. Not almost. Not the faint curve she'd learned to recognize. Actually laughed. Low, brief, real. Sophie stopped. Dante stopped too. Silence. They looked at each other. Outside the cellar door, someone dropped something. A loud, metallic clang. Dante's eyes moved toward the door. Sophie pressed her lips together. Was that a guard? Yes. Did your guard just drop something because you laughed? Dante's expression flattened. No. Another sound came from outside. Someone muttered urgently. Sophie lost the battle. She laughed again. Dante gave her a long look. Dangerously comfortable. With you? With employment. Sophie smiled. You haven't fired me yet. Repeated oversight. That's practically affection. The word slipped out. Affection. Neither of them moved. Sophie's smile softened. Dante looked at her differently. The air shifted, just slightly. Enough. Sophie reached for another bottle to break the moment, and that was when she saw it. A bottle on the lower rack. Dust along the shoulders. Faded cream label. Small crest near the bottom. Sophie stopped. Her hand remained suspended. Dante noticed immediately. What? Nothing. Too fast. He knew it. Sophie reached for another bottle instead. Dante's eyes went toward the one she'd been staring at, then back to her. Sophie. She forced a smile. Do you want the Bordeaux or not? Dante didn't answer. He crouched and removed the bottle. Sophie went still. The crest faced her. A tiny vine looping around an old-fashioned letter B. Her father's vineyard had once distributed wine through the same cooperative. She hadn't seen that mark in years, not since everything fell apart. Dante watched her face. Sophie immediately looked away. Put it back! He studied the bottle. Why? I don't like it. You haven't tasted it. I don't need to. Her voice had changed. The humor was gone. Dante heard it. He placed the bottle down, not back in the rack, on the table. Sophie grabbed her plate. I should go. Dante could have stopped her. He didn't. Sophie reached the door. His voice came quietly from behind. I'm not asking tonight. She stopped. Her fingers tightened around the plate. Dante continued. But one day, Sophie, a beat. You're going to tell me why that label scares you. Sophie looked over her shoulder. There was no teasing in his expression. No demand, just certainty. And somehow, that made her chest tighten more than pressure would have. She left. Dante remained in the cellar. His gaze returned to the faded crest. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people hiding things. Money, loyalty, fear, ambition. Sophie Bennett was different. Whatever she hid, hurt. And for the first time in years, Dante Romano found himself wanting to understand someone's silence, not because it threatened him, because he cared what had caused it. 3 days passed before Sophie returned to the wine room. Dante didn't summon her. That surprised her. On the first evening, she expected one of his guards. Nothing. The second, nothing. By the third, Sophie had become annoyed, which was ridiculous. She had spent weeks complaining that Dante summoned her too often. Now he had stopped, and somehow that was offensive. At 7:15, Sophie found herself walking past his study. The door was open. Dante sat behind his desk. He didn't look up. Sophie slowed, then continued. 3 steps. Stopped. Turned around. This was embarrassing. She walked back. Dante remained focused on his paperwork. Sophie stood in the doorway. He finally looked up. Yes? She frowned. Yes? You're standing in my doorway. I know. Dante waited. Sophie became irritated by his calm. Aren't you forgetting something? He glanced around the desk. No. She stared. Wine. The man was pretending he didn't understand. Sophie folded her arms. Fine. She turned. Sophie. She stopped. Dante opened the lower drawer of his desk, removed a bottle, set it on top. Sophie looked at it. Then him. He'd been waiting. The horrible man had been waiting. You're impossible. So I've been told. She walked into the study, trying very hard not to smile. The bottle wasn't the one with the vineyard crest. Dante didn't mention it. Neither did Sophie. That mattered. They drank, argued, laughed, and slowly, the awkwardness disappeared. 2 weeks later, Dante had business outside the city. A small private wine merchant had requested a meeting concerning several collectible bottles. Normally, Dante would have sent someone. Instead, at 11 that morning, Sophie was polishing silver when Leo Marchetti appeared beside her holding a garment bag. Sophie looked at him, then the bag. No, Leo sighed. I haven't said anything. That's becoming a Romano family tactic. He wants you to come. Sophie stared. Where? Wine merchant. She looked down at her maid's uniform. Leo lifted the garment bag. Sophie looked back at him. Oh, absolutely not. 30 minutes later, Sophie was wearing the dress. Mrs. Russo had selected it, which meant resistance had been futile from the beginning. Deep rose fabric, soft at the waist, elegant without trying too hard. Sophie looked at herself in the mirror, then looked toward Mrs. Russo. You planned this. The older woman adjusted one sleeve. I folded it. That is not a denial. Mrs. Russo smiled. Barely. Sophie should have known. When she entered the front hall, Dante was waiting. White shirt, dark jacket, hands in his pockets. He looked toward her and stopped. No dramatic reaction, no ridiculous compliment. Dante Romano simply stared. Sophie noticed immediately. That was far more satisfying. She walked closer. Something wrong? Dante recovered. No. She waited. Nothing else. Sophie smiled. Good. She passed him. Dante turned. Leo stood behind them. Leo looked at Dante. Dante looked at Leo. Leo immediately looked somewhere else. The drive was 40 minutes. Sophie spent the first 10 pretending Dante hadn't stared. Dante spent the first 10 pretending he hadn't been caught staring. Neither was particularly convincing. The wine merchant occupied an old converted stone building, surrounded by vineyards. The smell hit Sophie first. Wood, fruit, earth, memory. Her steps slowed. Dante noticed. But again, no pressure. Inside, the merchant brought out 6 bottles. Sophie listened, tasted, asked questions. At first, the merchant directed every answer toward Dante. Then Sophie corrected one detail about the year. Politely. The man paused. Later, she identified a storage problem from the cork alone, by the 4th bottle. The merchant was speaking to her. Dante sat back, watched, and something warm settled in his chest. Sophie belonged in this room, not because of her dress, not because she had arrived with Dante Romano, because she knew what she was doing. Afterward, they walked outside beneath a covered terrace. Rain had started, soft, steady. Sophie leaned against the railing. Dante stood beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Then Sophie said, "My father would have loved that place." There it was. No pressure, no interrogation. She had offered it herself. Dante remained quiet. Sophie watched the rain. "My father was called Daniel Bennett." Her smile appeared. Small. He could tell if someone was touching his barrels from the other side of the building. Dante listened. Sophie told him about the small vineyard outside Napa, where she'd spent part of her childhood before her family moved east. Not glamorous, not enormous. Her father managed the vineyard and later opened a modest tasting shop. Sophie practically grew up behind the counter. At 12, she could identify regions by smell better than many adults. At 16, her father began teaching her seriously. By 21, Sophie had certifications, experience, and a plan. The shop would eventually become hers. She would expand it, create tasting classes, maybe even buy a small vineyard one day. That had been the future. Then, her father died, suddenly, and grief came with paperwork, loans, medical bills. Business debts Sophie hadn't known existed. For nearly a year, she tried to save everything. The shop, the inventory, the lease, the tiny collection her father had spent decades building. One by one, they disappeared. She sold what she could, closed what she couldn't save, then stopped tasting wine completely. Because every bottle became a door, and Sophie was tired of walking through it into a room where her father no longer existed. Years passed, different jobs, different cities. Eventually, the Romano estate. Sophie looked down at her hands. "The first time I saw your bottle," she smiled faintly. "I recognized the cooperative mark." Dante understood. The crest. Sophie nodded. "My father used to work with vineyards that carried it." Rain tapped quietly against the roof. Sophie exhaled. "I wasn't trying to steal your wine." Dante looked at her. She gave him a look. "All right." Technically, by sip 3, theft had become difficult to dispute. His mouth moved. Sophie smiled. "But at first," her voice softened, "I just wanted to know if I could remember." Dante said nothing. No pity. No speech about how sorry he was. No promise to fix everything. Sophie was grateful. After a while, he asked one question. "Did you?" Sophie looked toward the vineyards beyond the rain. "Remember?" Dante nodded. She smiled. Everything. Something changed between them, quietly. Dante had known Sophie was hiding a past. Now he understood she wasn't ashamed of it. She was grieving it. And Sophie, for the first time, understood why Dante's silence around her felt different from everyone else's. He didn't rush to fill it. He let her own it. The rain became heavier. Sophie shivered slightly. Dante removed his jacket. She immediately protested. He placed it around her shoulders anyway. "Bossy!" "You're cold. That doesn't make you less bossy." "No." She looked at him. He looked at her. Close. Too close. The teasing faded. For several seconds, neither moved. Dante's eyes dropped briefly toward her mouth. Sophie noticed. Her heartbeat changed. His hand rested against the railing beside hers. Almost touching, Sophie could have moved away. She didn't. Dante leaned slightly closer. Then, his phone rang. Sophie closed her eyes. Dante looked toward the sky, as though considering whether technology could be eliminated permanently. Sophie laughed. Dangerous criminal empire? Dante checked the screen. Unfortunately, he answered. Sophie turned toward the rain to hide her smile, but the moment remained, unfinished, waiting. And when Dante finished the call, his expression had changed. The warmth disappeared. A shipment connected to one of his businesses had arrived with inventory missing. Nothing enormous. Nothing that would alarm anyone else. But Dante Romano had survived by noticing small inconsistencies. And lately, too many small things inside his organization were beginning not to add up. After the trip, Dante started coming home earlier. Nobody officially discussed it. Everybody noticed. His driver noticed first. Leo noticed second. Mrs. Russo probably noticed before either of them, but simply chose not to announce it. Sophie noticed on Tuesday. She was arranging flowers in the west sitting room when Dante walked through at 4:20. She looked toward the clock. Then him. Aren't you supposed to be frightening businessmen until 6? Dante removed his watch. Finished early. Sophie looked toward the flowers. Interesting. What? Nothing. Wednesday. He appeared in the kitchen at 5. Sophie was tasting sauce. Dante claimed he wanted water. The Romano estate contained approximately 14 people capable of bringing him water. Apparently, all 14 had become unavailable. Sophie handed him a glass. He remained. She looked at him. Anything else? No. He didn't leave. Sophie waited. Dante looked toward the stove. What are you making? She stared. You came into the kitchen for water, and now you're asking about dinner. Dante drank calmly. I can multitask. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Thursday. He appeared in the laundry corridor. That was when Sophie stopped pretending. She was carrying folded linens. Dante came around the corner. She stopped directly in front of him. No. Dante looked at her. No? This is the third day. What is? You. His eyebrow lifted. You keep appearing. I live here. Not in the laundry corridor. Dante looked around. Apparently I do today. Sophie stared. He walked past. She turned. Dante. He stopped. That was the first time she'd used his first name without thinking. Both noticed. Sophie tightened her hold on the linens. Dante looked back. Something subtle changed in his expression. She recovered first. You are following me around your own house. Dante considered. Is that possible? Yes. I own the corridor. Wealth does not change grammar. His mouth almost curved. Sophie walked away before her face betrayed her. Dante watched her go. Behind him, Leo stepped from a side room. He had heard everything. Dante turned. Leo immediately began walking in the opposite direction. Wise man. A week later, Dante received an invitation to a private wine auction. Normally, he attended alone or sent Leo. This time, Sophie found an envelope beside her dinner plate in the staff kitchen, her name written across the front. She opened it. Inside was a single card. Saturday, 7. Sophie stared. Mrs. Russo walked past. Sophie held up the card. He's doing it again. Mrs. Russo continued walking. Doing what? Ordering me around using stationery. No idea. Sophie watched her leave. Everyone in this house is dishonest. Saturday evening arrived. Sophie wore a dark green gown this time. Elegant. Soft around her curves. Hair pinned loosely at the back. When she descended the staircase, Dante was waiting below. Again. He stared. Again. Sophie caught him. This time she smiled immediately. You really should work on that. Dante looked toward her face. On? The staring. I wasn't staring. Sophie reached the final step. Of course. Dante offered his arm. She took it. Your face was simply conducting a prolonged inspection. He looked down at her. Quality control. Sophie stopped. Dante continued walking. She stared after him, then laughed. That was terrible. It worked. Unfortunately, it had. The auction was filled with wealthy collectors, restaurant owners, investors, and enough expensive perfume to alter atmospheric conditions. Sophie expected to feel out of place. She didn't. Wine had always been one world where money could pretend to be expertise. Until someone actually opened the bottle. Dante understood that quickly. Several men greeted him. Most barely acknowledged Sophie. One older collector assumed she was Dante's assistant and handed her his empty glass. Sophie looked at the glass, then at him. Dante saw everything. He said nothing. Instead, when the next lot appeared, Dante asked Sophie whether it was worth bidding, in front of everyone. The collector glanced toward her. Sophie studied the catalogue. No, Dante didn't bid. The bottle sold for $28,000. 5 minutes later, another lot appeared. Dante looked at Sophie. She nodded. He bought it. Then another. He asked again, and again. By the fourth time, people had stopped treating Sophie like staff. Now they were listening. Sophie noticed. So did Dante. That mattered more than if he'd publicly embarrassed anyone. He hadn't announced her intelligence. He had simply trusted it where everyone could see. Later, on the balcony overlooking the city, Sophie stood beside him holding champagne. You did that deliberately. Dante looked toward the skyline. Did what? She smiled. I hate when you pretend not to know things. Then stop asking questions you know the answer to. Sophie turned toward him. Their shoulders nearly touched. You made them listen. No. Dante's eyes moved toward hers. You did. That quiet answer reached somewhere deep. Sophie looked down at the glass. For once, no joke came. Dante reached up. A loose strand of hair had fallen near her cheek. His fingers brushed it back. Sophie stopped breathing for approximately 1 second, maybe 2. His hand remained near her face. The city disappeared. The auction disappeared. The people inside disappeared. Dante leaned closer. This time, no rain, no phone, no interruption. Almost. Leo opened the balcony door. Boss. Dante closed his eyes. Sophie bit her lip to avoid laughing. Leo looked between them, realized, regretted every professional choice that had brought him to this exact balcony. I can come back. Dante looked at him. No. Leo remained very still. There's a problem. The humor left Dante's face. A wine shipment connected to Romano-owned restaurants had arrived, with several cases missing. Again, not enough to justify panic. Enough to establish a pattern. On the drive home, Dante was quieter. Sophie noticed. She didn't ask immediately. Eventually, he explained that inventory had been disappearing across different businesses for months. Wine, imported food, small luxury shipments. Never enough to look dramatic, but combined, significant money. Someone inside Dante's organization was stealing, and doing it carefully. Sophie looked toward the dark road outside. What does wine have to do with it? Dante's gaze moved toward her. That's what I'm trying to determine. Neither knew yet that the answer was already sitting inside Dante's private cellar, hidden among hundreds of bottles, waiting to be opened. The dinner was supposed to be boring. Sophie knew because Dante had used the phrase, routine meeting. In Dante Romano's world, routine meetings involved 6 men in dark suits, arriving through separate entrances, while guards inspected vehicles. Sophie had stopped questioning the definition. The dining room was prepared. Candles, crystal, white linen. 2 bottles Sophie had personally selected, and 1 bottle she hadn't. She noticed it 20 minutes before dinner. Sophie entered the dining room to inspect the table. Her eyes moved automatically toward the wine. 2 familiar bottles. Then, a third. Dark glass. Older vintage. Sophie frowned. She hadn't chosen it. She picked it up. The label looked legitimate. The seal looked normal. Everything appeared fine. Still, something bothered her. She called one of the servers. "Who brought this?" the young man thought. "Mr. Caruso." Sophie looked up. Carlo Vieri, Dante's logistics director. He had worked with the Romano organization for nearly 11 years. Trusted, quiet, efficient. He controlled several import routes, including wine shipments. Sophie looked back at the bottle. Did Mr. Romano ask for it? The server wasn't sure. Sophie set it down. Something small tightened in her stomach. She should have left it. Instead, she examined the cork, then the capsule, then the glass near the neck. Nothing obvious. That was the problem. If something was wrong, someone had worked very hard to make it look right. Dinner began. Sophie wasn't serving. She was supposed to return upstairs. She didn't. From the hall, she watched. Dante sat at the head of the table, Leo beside him, Carlo Vieri farther down. Conversation moved calmly. Business, shipping, money. Exactly the kind of topics that usually made Sophie's attention wander. Then the server reached for the unfamiliar bottle. Sophie's eyes sharpened. The cork came free. She heard it. A soft sound. Normal. Almost. The server poured. Sophie smelled something from several feet away. Faint. Wrong. Her body reacted before her mind finished processing it. She stepped into the room. Wait. The conversation stopped. 6 powerful men looked toward the Curvy Maid standing in the doorway. Dante's hand paused near his glass. Sophie crossed the room. No apology. No hesitation. Don't drink that. Silence. Dante looked at her. 1 second. 2. Then, he moved his hand away from the glass. Immediately, that trust nearly frightened Sophie more than the bottle. Carlo Vieri frowned. What's the problem? Sophie ignored him. She leaned toward the wine. Did not taste, just smelled. Her expression tightened. Dante watched. You're sure? Sophie looked at him. No. A beat. But I'm sure enough. That was all Dante needed. The meeting ended. Quietly. No panic. No dramatic shouting. The bottle was secured. Every person in the room remained inside until security completed preliminary checks. Sophie stood near the fireplace. Dante approached. You weren't supposed to be here. She folded her arms. You're welcome. His jaw tightened. Sophie saw it. There was fear beneath the anger. Not for himself, for her. 2 hours later, a specialist confirmed the wine had been deliberately contaminated with a dangerous substance. No details were needed. The intention was obvious. Had Dante emptied the glass, he might not have survived the evening. The Romano estate changed instantly. Doors locked. Security doubled. Staff questioned. Shipments frozen. Dante became terrifyingly calm. Sophie had learned enough about him to know quiet Dante was considerably more dangerous than loud Dante. Leo arrived in the study after midnight. The bottle had been traced through an internal shipment. Records indicated it should never have reached Dante's private cellar. Someone had altered the inventory. Someone with access. Someone trusted. Dante looked toward Sophie and made a decision. 2 guards. Her eyes narrowed. No. 3. Dante. 4. She stared. This is not an auction. It can become one. Sophie folded her arms. I don't need 4 guards. You almost identified an attempt on my life. That sentence does not explain why I need an escort to the pantry. It does to me. Sophie opened her mouth, stopped, then pointed toward him. 2. Dante said nothing. 2 guards. And they stay outside the bathroom. Leo turned away. Immediately, Dante looked at him. Leo found the bookshelf fascinating. Dante returned to Sophie. Fine. The guards began the following morning. By lunchtime, they regretted everything. Sophie went to the kitchen. 2 men followed. Laundry room. 2 men. Garden. 2 men. At 1:30, she entered the pantry. Both followed. Sophie stopped, turned. They stopped too. She looked toward a 20-pound bag of flour, then at the younger guard. You. He looked alarmed. Carry that. He blinked. Sophie smiled. If we're going everywhere together, everyone works. By day 2, one guard carried groceries. The other held baskets. Mrs. Russo approved. Dante did not. Sophie considered this a success. But beneath the jokes, fear remained. Sophie caught herself checking bottles twice, listening for footsteps, watching unfamiliar faces. Dante noticed. He also stopped sleeping properly. She found him late one evening on the rear terrace, alone. A glass sat untouched beside him. That frightened Sophie more than if he'd been drinking. She approached. Dante looked toward her. You shouldn't be outside. There it was. Sophie stopped. For 4 days, she had accepted the guards, accepted the locked gates, accepted being driven everywhere. But that sentence, something inside her snapped. I live here too. You work here. Even worse. Employees generally require access to the building. Dante's expression hardened. This isn't funny. I know. Her voice softened. That got his attention. Sophie stepped closer. You're scared. Dante's jaw tightened. No. Terrible lie. He looked toward the garden. Sophie continued. You're trying to control everything because you can't control whoever did this. Silence. Dante finally looked at her. Someone tried to kill me, and failed, because of you. The words came harder than he'd intended. Sophie stopped. Dante stood. His voice became lower. What do you think I thought when they confirmed that bottle? She didn't answer. I thought about you smelling it. A beat, touching it. Another. Standing in that room with whoever put it there. Sophie understood. Dante wasn't afraid of dying. Not in the way she had assumed. He was afraid she had entered the danger with him. His fear simply wore the only shape Dante trusted. Control. Sophie stepped closer. I'll keep the guards. He watched her. I'll tell you where I'm going. Another step. I'll be careful. She stopped directly in front of him. But you don't get to hide me, because somebody decided I matter to you. Silence. There it was. Matter. Neither of them had said it before. Sophie's heartbeat changed. Dante's eyes did too. She looked away. Then he spoke. You matter. Quiet. Certain. Sophie looked back. No humor. No teasing. Just truth. Dante's hand moved toward her face. Slowly enough that she could stop him. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek. Sophie smiled faintly. You know, Dante's eyes narrowed. If you're about to make a joke, I was. His thumb moved gently beneath her cheekbone. Don't. That made her smile wider. Then he kissed her. No audience. No dramatic music. No guards watching. At least, Sophie sincerely hoped no guards were watching. The kiss began carefully. It did not remain careful for long. Months of arguments, looks, almost moments, private tastings, and one deeply irresponsible stolen glass of wine finally caught up with them. When they separated, Sophie rested her forehead briefly against his chest, then looked toward him. So, the Dante exhaled. She smiled. Does this change my employment benefits? He stared at her. Sophie lost control and laughed. Dante shook his head, then kissed her again. The following morning, Sophie remembered something. A small thing. Several weeks earlier, she had gone downstairs late to return a tray. Someone had been inside the wine cellar, Carlo Vieri. At the time, nothing strange. Carlo handled import shipments. Of course he had access. But now, Sophie remembered how quickly he'd shut one cabinet when he noticed her, and what he'd said. Inventory issue. Nothing important. Sophie stopped in the corridor. Her smile disappeared. 10 minutes later, she was inside Dante's study. And this time, when she said Carlo Vieri's name, Dante did not laugh. Dante didn't accuse Carlo immediately. That surprised Sophie. She expected anger. Instead, Dante became colder, methodical. Carlo had worked beside him for 11 years. He knew the businesses, import routes, restaurant deliveries, security schedules, wine cellar access. If Sophie was wrong, Dante refused to destroy a decade of loyalty over suspicion. If she was right, they needed proof. So they created a very simple trap. Dante casually announced that a rare bottle from his private collection would be served at a dinner 2 nights later. Only a handful of senior men heard, Carlo among them. The bottle itself remained untouched. A hidden camera covered the relevant storage area. The inventory system was monitored. Nothing happened the first night. Sophie pretended she wasn't nervous. She was terrible at pretending. At 11:30, she sat beside Dante in his study, eating crackers directly from a plate Mrs. Russo had sent upstairs. Dante was watching security screens. Sophie looked at him, then toward the plate. Romantic. Dante didn't look away. You insisted on staying. I pictured less surveillance. You have unusual expectations for dating. Sophie smiled. Dating? Dante finally looked at her. She raised an eyebrow. You kissed me twice and assigned me armed escorts. A beat. That is not a conventional courtship. Dante almost smiled. Then movement appeared on one monitor. Both turned. Someone entered the cellar. Carlo. Sophie's humor disappeared. He moved directly toward the announced bottle, opened a storage cabinet, removed something small. Dante stood. Security entered seconds later. Carlo froze. There was no dramatic chase, no ridiculous confession, just proof. And then, the larger truth began unraveling. Carlo hadn't only been involved with the altered wine. For nearly 2 years, he had been manipulating imported luxury shipments. Small discrepancies, cases disappearing, invoices modified, payments redirected. Wine shipments had been particularly useful because values varied wildly from bottle to bottle. A missing case could be explained as damage, a substituted bottle overlooked, a changed invoice buried. Carlo had been moving money toward a rival group, while quietly weakening Dante's businesses from inside. The contaminated bottle was supposed to solve his final problem, Dante himself. If Dante died after an ordinary private dinner, Carlo expected confusion, internal fighting, opportunities. Instead, a curious maid with an inconveniently excellent nose ruined everything. The irony was not lost on Sophie. Hours later, after security had taken over, Sophie sat in the wine room. Dante entered. She looked at him. So, he waited. I believe this officially makes my unauthorized drinking useful. Dante stared. Sophie continued. If I had respected workplace boundaries, no. If I hadn't stolen your wine, no. Technically, Sophie, she smiled. Dante approached. You are never using attempted murder to justify stealing my wine. Then we remember history differently. His hands settled lightly at her waist. Sophie's smile softened. The danger wasn't entirely gone, but the betrayal had been exposed. Dante was alive. She was safe. And for the first time, the wine room felt like itself again. Not evidence, not danger, just the place where something ridiculous had become something real. Weeks passed. The estate slowly returned to normal. Sophie's guards remained, mostly because Dante refused to remove them. Sophie eventually stopped complaining, mostly because she discovered they were useful for carrying groceries. One afternoon, the younger guard followed her into the pantry. Sophie pointed silently toward a bag of flour. He sighed, picked it up. Traditions mattered. But something else had changed. Sophie couldn't ignore the old dream anymore. Wine had returned to her life, not as grief, as possibility. She began reading again, studying, writing notes, researching small tasting rooms in the city, looking at business plans after work. Dante noticed. Of course. One evening, Sophie entered his study. No stolen glass this time, just an envelope. She placed it on his desk. Dante opened it, read, then went very still, her resignation. Sophie nearly laughed. For a man who had survived an attempt on his life, Dante Romano looked remarkably disturbed by paperwork. "You're leaving?" "No." He looked at the page. "This says otherwise. I'm leaving the job." His eyes returned to hers. "Not you." Dante relaxed approximately half an inch. Sophie saw it. Immediately. She smiled. "Oh, that's adorable." His expression hardened. "Don't. You were worried." "Sophie, you thought I was leaving you." Dante stood. She laughed. "This is going to sustain me emotionally for years." He approached. Sophie backed away, still laughing. "Eventually," she explained. She wanted to start again. Small. A tasting room, maybe classes, private events, a place where people didn't need expensive vocabulary to enjoy wine. Something with her name above the door. Something her father would recognize, but that still belonged to her. Dante listened. Then made the most Dante Romano suggestion imaginable. "I'll buy the building." "No." He blinked. "Startup capital." "No." "Equipment." "No." "A loan." "No." Dante stared. Sophie had witnessed armed men challenge him with less visible confusion. "What exactly am I allowed to do?" Sophie smiled. "Support me." His expression suggested this option was suspiciously inexpensive. "That's it?" "That is not it." Dante folded his arms. Sophie stepped closer. "Come when I open." "I would anyway. Tell people. They'll come. Pretend not to inspect the security system." "No." She sighed. "Fine. Inspect it once. Twice." "Dante. Once." She smiled. "Support me." He nodded. And he did. 6 months later, Bennett and Vine opened. Small storefront. Warm wooden interior. A tasting counter. Photographs of vineyards on the walls. And one framed page from Daniel Bennett's old notebook behind the register. Sophie cried on opening morning, then denied it aggressively. Dante did not challenge the lie. Business started slowly, then grew. Sophie's classes became popular because she refused to make wine intimidating. If someone said a bottle smelled like strawberries, good. If someone said it tasted like Christmas, also good. If someone said angry berries, Sophie gave them a discount. Dante became the most irritating customer in Chicago. His first visit was legitimate. Second, possibly. By the fifth, Sophie became suspicious. He entered at 6:15 carrying a bottle. She looked at him. "No." Dante stopped. "I haven't spoken. You're here again. I require an opinion. That bottle came from my shop." Dante looked at the label. Sophie folded her arms. "You bought it here 3 days ago. Maybe something changed. Wine does not develop emotional problems in 72 hours. His eyebrow lifted. Sophie leaned against the counter. "If you want to see your girlfriend, Dante," a pause, "you can simply ask." Dante considered. "Dinner. Tuesday. 7. Sophie stared. The horrible man had been waiting for that. "You planned this." "No. You absolutely planned this." "Tuesday?" She narrowed her eyes. Then smiled. 7:30. 7. 7:15. Dante held out his hand. Sophie shook it. "Done." Then he pulled her gently across the counter and kissed her. One customer applauded. Sophie nearly threw a cork at him. Almost 1 year after the afternoon, Dante caught Sophie drinking his wine. He asked her to come back to the Romano estate. No explanation. That alone made Sophie suspicious. She entered the wine room, stopped. One bottle sat on the center table. Old, dusty, faded label. Sophie walked closer. Her breath caught. The crest. Not the cooperative crest. Her father's. Daniel Bennett had produced only a tiny private batch before the shop closed. Most bottles had been sold years earlier. Sophie had assumed none remained. Her fingers trembled as she touched the label. "Where did you find this?" Dante stood behind her. "Collector in Oregon." Sophie turned. "You tracked this down?" 3 collectors. She looked toward the bottle again. Emotion tightened her throat. Dante hadn't opened it, hadn't restored the damaged label, hadn't polished away the age. He had simply brought it home. For Sophie. Her eyes filled. She laughed softly through it. "You bought me old wine." Dante's expression remained serious. "I was told you liked wine." Sophie laughed harder. There he was. Dante. She wiped beneath one eye, then noticed something beside the bottle. Small black box. Her laughter stopped. Dante picked it up, for the first time since Sophie had known him. Dante Romano looked nervous. Actually nervous. She stared. "This is extraordinary." His eyes narrowed. "What? You're terrified." "Sophie." She smiled through tears. "I wish Leo could see this." "Open the box." She did. Ring. Simple. Elegant. Beautiful. Sophie's mouth parted. No enormous audience. No ballroom. No speech prepared for anyone else. Just Sophie. Dante. And one surviving bottle from the life she once believed she'd lost completely. Dante looked at her, then asked her to marry him. Sophie did not make him wait. Yes. One word. Immediate. Dante exhaled. Sophie laughed. "You were actually worried I'd say no. I was considering possibilities. You were panicking." He slipped the ring onto her finger. "Sophie, I'm enjoying this enormously." Dante pulled her closer, then kissed her, slowly. No danger, no secrets, no reason to hide. Later. They opened the bottle. Sophie insisted. Her hands shook slightly as she poured 2 glasses. She smelled it first, closed her eyes, and smiled. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. Age had changed it. Time had softened some things, taken others away. But beneath everything, Sophie recognized it. Home. She lifted the glass toward her lips. Dante watched. Then, that familiar voice came calmly from across the table. "Enjoying yourself?" Sophie froze mid-sip. Slowly, she lowered the glass, looked at Dante, then at the ring on her finger. 1 year earlier, those words had nearly stopped her heart. Now, they made her smile. "Much more now that I don't have to hide." Dante raised his glass. Sophie considered, then added, although stealing it was considerably more exciting. His eyebrow lifted. "You're not stealing this one. I could. You own half of it. That has never stopped me from making poor decisions." Dante stared. Sophie grinned. And finally, Dante Romano laughed. The same low laugh Sophie had once heard, disappearing down a corridor after she'd been caught drinking his wine. Except this time, he didn't hide it. Sophie laughed with him. A year earlier, she had secretly lifted one forbidden glass because she wanted to remember the woman she used to be. The daughter who knew vineyards. The woman who dreamed of building something. The Sophie Bennett who had been buried beneath bills, grief, and years of simply surviving. She thought Dante Romano caught her doing something foolish. Instead, he caught a glimpse of someone Sophie herself had almost forgotten. And somewhere between stolen wine, private tastings, terrible excuses, dangerous bottles, ridiculous guards, and a Mafia boss who slowly learned that protecting someone did not mean controlling them, Sophie found that woman again. Dante hadn't given Sophie her future. He had simply looked at her, listened, trusted her, and stood beside her while she reclaimed it herself. Now the shop was hers, the dream was hers, the ring was hers, and the terrifying Mafia boss sitting across from her. Well, Sophie smiled over the rim of her glass. He was hers too, mostly. Dante caught the expression. What? Nothing. He narrowed his eyes. Sophie took another sip, this one completely legal, then smiled. Quality control. Dante closed his eyes, and Sophie Bennett laughed all over again.